Sardi is a graduate of the University of Chicago with a degree in economics. He then attended the Zicklin School at Baruch University, part of the City University of New York, where he earned a master's degree in statistics. He didn't feel he was well enough educated at that point, so he went to England and received his PhD at the University of Cambridge. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Mark Sardi.
And again, thank you for not getting too flowery. Yes. So, and what I would add is that the degree in economics actually came after a failed attempt at a degree in physics. So, thank you for having me here. I'm honored to be here in the Winter Park community, which I spend a lot of time in, and to get to know some of my neighbors. So I'm going to try to make this a little more interactive. If you have a question, or if you have something that you'd like to sort of ask or even contribute, that's fine. Just let me know. Raise your hand, and I'll try to. I try not to make it too much like the classroom, but we'll go from there. Okay. How many of you have been to Asia before? How many of you have been to China? Okay, so quite a few of you have been to China. And so I'm not talking to a group of people who are unfamiliar with the topic, and certainly with what's going on there. Asia is a very large area, and there are so many intricate things going on in each of the countries in Asia. I thought I'd narrow it down to China, and the topic was China and the Asian century. And I put a question mark at the end of it, and that was deliberate, because there are still many questions to be answered. So we'll sort of take it from there. Okay. One of the things I came across in looking at things to prepare this was a survey that was done back in 2000 about satisfaction in life. And yes, global map, basically darker countries being places where people are more satisfied. Incidentally, they have another survey which looks at happiness, and happiness and satisfaction, incidentally, don't seem to overlap, right? Countries who are happier don't necessarily seem to be countries who are more satisfied. Well, why is that relevant? The countries who are lighter tend to be the countries who are less satisfied. And if you look at Asia, granted, not every country in Asia was surveyed, but some of what you see is that Asia's a place where people aren't satisfied. There's a lot more drive, obviously a lot more poverty, and a lot more people. And what that leads to is a sort of yearning to kind of go forward, to do more, and to perhaps change the way that the life around them works. And there's a lot going on there right now that's interesting to consider. Another interesting thing that I looked at, which I think is important when you frame what's going on in Asia, is to take a look at what chief executive officers are doing, or what their thoughts are. The most recent CEO survey, which was done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, had asked about 186 CEOs of companies what they believed were the areas for future growth opportunities. And interestingly, some of these topics came up. Now, this seems somewhat irrelevant when we talk about Asia, but when you understand that many of the countries in Asia are starting to specialize, because they don't have the infrastructure that we do for some of the kinds of businesses and some of the educational careers. But what you're finding is countries like India and China and many of the other small or developing countries are finding more and more students specializing in intellectual technologies, so programming and things like that. And what's also interesting about that is that there are more and more online, what we call crowdsourcing, or systems available for people to hire programmers in those countries directly, rather than through aggregators, for example, Elance or freelancers, where you can actually go online tomorrow and hire someone from any country in the world based on the portfolio of work they've done. I've done this with students at Rollins, where we have students develop mobile applications, and they often end up hiring the lowest cost programmer with the best resume and portfolio, and invariably those folks will come from places like Indonesia, China. We've had some from, quite a few from India as well. But when you look at the businesses, you see business analytics, again, lends itself very heavily to a lot of what the training, which is currently going on in Asia, is. Socially enabled business processes, mobile customer engagement, cybersecurity, that's becoming a big issue, and I think some of you may have heard of some of the more recent issues between the United States and China on that. On-demand business technology and services, sensors, robotics. Many of these are actually industries which various countries in Asia are putting a lot of effort into developing the intellectual capacity. They're also, when asked where are the changes going to come from that'll transform their businesses, many are saying from technological advances. Well, a lot of that is happening here and in some of the developed world, but quite a bit of it is happening in some of the developing countries in Asia. Demographic shifts. Well, there's no place where there'll be more demographic shifts than in Asia. You have several of the most populous countries in the world, China, India, Indonesia, all there, many of which will have, and we'll talk a little bit more about the demographics with regard to China in a moment, but the demographic shifts are going to drive businesses in many different industries. Shift in global economic power, and that's another thing that's important with regard to Asia. And resource scarcity and climate change. Once again, all of these hit square in Asia. And urbanization, need I say more? Okay, so China's past and present. Most of you, I would imagine, and I'm going to date myself here, remember the days when, China was still very much a communist country and very much a place where people from the West were not really welcome. Richard Nixon's trip to China in the 1970s started the process of opening the doors. Clearly, if you go back a little further than that, prior to World War I, you still have the empire, and interestingly, the West knew very little about China. I mean, you have a country that was one of the most populous on the planet, the West knew very little about, and it just so happens, just a little historical context, which I'm sure you're well aware of, that one British officer who happened to be a alumnus and professor from my alma mater at Cambridge, had been assigned to China during World War II and spent his time racing ahead of the Japanese to collect whatever antiquities he could get his hands on, bring them back home to England, where they ultimately landed at Cambridge University. He then wrote multiple volumes. That's right, he stole them. No, actually, the interesting part of that was he had built such a good reputation for not just saving the materials, but for also writing about them in a way that educated people in the West about all these innovations and things that had happened in China first, well before what we thought were the first appearances of them in the West. And it really kind of opened the door for the West seeing China as more than just this alien place. Obviously, further back in history, we only knew of China through commerce that came by way of India, by way of the Middle East, and very few in the West were even aware of the existence of China. It was almost a mythical place. But what we have seen is that over the last 20, 30 years, China has gone from a country which was extremely, we'll say, totalitarian, very communist, very close to the West. With Deng Xiaoping's reforms and the things that brought in, the country turned the corner. And when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization in the 90s, that changed everything. China advanced extremely rapidly from that point forward. And what you see is this not just development of the country, but you see a development of industry, you see an openness of trade with the West, and you see a reinvigoration of adhering to more of the rules which have previously folks in China were not really that concerned. And part of that is a mindset. It's a mindset with regard to China. It's a different mindset. We have collectivist versus individualistic societies in the West. We're a lot more individualistic, right? I'm going to achieve, I'm going to do better, I'm going to lead. In China, we, the community, are everything. The idea of intellectual property didn't really exist in China until the mid-90s, and the first property laws that were constitutionalized in China had to do with real estate. So real estate it was 1996 when the Constitution of China was written. That's how recently it was done. Real estate property became something that was recognized by China, but intellectual property took a bit longer. And the legal system in China also created problems with this because judges, unlike here in the United States, were appointed by the party. And that means that they didn't necessarily have to have the legal training and education in order to do that job. And that meant when a case appeared before a judge in China, it could be decided on the merits, or it could be decided on how the judge felt that way, which had very little to do with the merits of the case or the legalities of it either. Much of that has changed, and as it's changed, more and more businesses have combined with China, combined with Asia, and things have moved significantly forward. So 2009, roughly 150 million Chinese were still living in extreme poverty. Although I will say this, more than 250 million of them were lifted out of poverty by the changes since China's joining of the World Trade Organization, right? They still have issues that are very serious and are becoming more serious today, such as national social safety nets, pension and universal health insurance, and millions of new jobs are needed every year just to keep up with the increase in the population, right? We'll talk a little bit more about the effect of the one-child policy on China, because that's been a major issue for them as well. To expand its economy, the PRC official said China had to shift from an export-led economy to a consumption-based economy. How many of you, if I were to ask you, who's the world's #1 producer of automobiles, who would you say? Japan, US, anyone else? It's China. And that's happened recently. I did a research paper several years ago where we were looking at the automotive industry, and we said, you know, it wasn't even that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago I wrote the paper, you know, within the next 10 or 15 years, China will be the #1 auto producer. Well, when you compare that with the decline in auto sales of the United States, China jumped right ahead of us. They first jumped ahead of Japan, then ahead of Germany, and then ahead of us. The most fascinating thing about this is they export very few cars. Most of the cars are actually consumed domestically. So, you know, and you have a growing market too. So that's led China to, you know, sort of grow very rapidly domestically. So then and now, as I said before, you know, if you go back to the 1970s, bilateral trade between the US and China amounted to about $100 million a year. 100 million, right? I think the US spends that in a few seconds, right? You know, there was very little two-way investment in each country, right? Only a handful of American jobs had anything to do with China at all. Today, more than $1 billion of goods and services go between the two countries daily. 800,000 jobs depend on things going from China to the United States and back again. And their economic growth performance is astounding, 9.7% a year. I mean, in the US, where we're happy to get a 0.5% increase in growth, a 0.5% would be a big failure in China. Right now, some of this is misleading because one of the biggest investors in GDP in China is the Chinese government, right? And that kind of misleads, that it kind of gives you an overinflated number. You see 9.7%. Some estimates are as much as 5% of that is coming from internal government spending or something going on. There's another factor in China that's also interesting, which is something called round tripping. And that's round tripping not just between foreign companies in China and back again, but between the Chinese working both within China, into Hong Kong, and back into mainland China again, to take advantage of special status given to companies that are working that way. So the financial crisis impacted all of us, and China as well. One of the things that's been an ongoing source of debate between China and the US has been the exchange rate. And I had it, but I didn't bring it with me. If you actually look at the exchange rate over the last decade, you would actually see the RMB slipping from about 8 RMB to the dollar to its current position of about 6.2 RMB to the dollar. Now, what that means is that there is some floating of the currency. What was very interesting is during the years of our financial crisis, flat. There was no change whatsoever, which meant the government actually stepped in, controlled the currency to keep the economy from sliding further. The main reason, of course, being that if the RMB rose too quickly or too rapidly against the dollar, imported goods here in the United States from China would become way too expensive or would become less competitive with other countries, not only in Asia, but maybe even within the United States and Europe as well.
What is the RMB?
RMB is the Chinese currency. It's called the renminbi. Some people call, there's another form called the yuan, but the renminbi is their currency. And one of the interesting things to keep in mind, and this is a more recent development, is that the RMB was never really it was not a tradable currency. And what that meant is if you were in China, you could exchange money for renminbi, but once you left China, there really wasn't an easy way to trade it. That gave the government a lot more control over the currency, but at the same time, it left the government dealing with a lot of the financial issues or currency issues that might arise. And that worked to their advantage in the Asian currency crisis in the mid-90s, where foreign currency speculators were going after many of the countries in Asia because they had, as you have in many cases, governments overspending without the resources to support it. and then the currency speculators going in and pushing them the extra mile to cause the currency to devalue. Well, China had way too much control over their currency and basically put a lot of the currency speculators out of business within a very short period of time because of that. So the RMB was not tradable, but that's just about to change. The Chinese government is about to create the ability for RMB and dollars to be traded on world markets, which is going to make it a lot more easy, or it's going to make it easier for others to speculate on the currency or to trade in the currency, as well as give the government a little bit more freedom on that as well. But to put things in perspective, Chinese affluent class by 2020, 120 million to 280 million account for about 5% of global consumption, and the affluent have an average household disposable income of at least 20,000. So things are changing in China. As they become more affluent, things change. And we're already starting to see, I think over the last few years, you've seen a shift by a lot of manufacturers who are building products in Asia to ship to other parts of the world, Europe, the United States, that many of them are actually diversifying their strategy. They're not just building factories in China, they're building factories in Vietnam, they're building factories in other countries as well, so that they don't, Taiwan as well, so that they don't have full dependence on China, because they anticipate the costs will rise to the point where China may not be as competitive. Now, interestingly, because of that shift in demographics in China, one of the things that we're beginning to see is that Chinese consumers are willing to pay a lot more for, guess what? Foreign-made goods, right? Made in America actually means something to people in China, right? One of the fascinating stories I'll get into in a minute is General Motors was one of the early companies to get into China. And many of you may be aware that one of the first product lines they brought into China was the Buick. Right now in America, Buick never really had the kind of status that, say, Pontiac or Cadillac or some of the other GM lines did, but in China, it became the aspirational car of choice. Right? Everybody in the party, the officials, the top officials wanted to drive a Buick. Right? So you go to China, and that's the Mercedes, Cadillac, whatever you want to use as your comparative vehicle. That's the car of choice of party officials. So the impact of this is that, and I'll talk about GM in a moment, GM sold more than 2.5 million vehicles in China last year alone. So when the US government stepped in to bail out General Motors and imposed the need to rationalize the product line, reduce it from all the different products they had, you had to eliminate a couple of brand names. That's what they were told. They eliminated Pontiac, which was a very very high-selling brand in the US, and kept Buick, which sales in the US were always pretty flat, relatively speaking, because they recognized the future of Buick was not in the US, it was in China. Now, the amusing thing for me was we visited a Buick plant with a group of students a few years ago, and before walking in there I said, why is GM manufacturing in China? And all of my students said, labor costs are cheaper, labor costs are cheaper. It's a good assumption, China's got lower labor costs. I said, when we walk in the factory, I want you to count how many people you see. So we walked in the factory, they hardly saw anyone. It was all automated, right? It was as automated as any factory you would see here in the United States, and there were very few laborers on the floor. So it was clear to them very quickly that they weren't manufacturing in China just because of labor. Technology is very strong in China as well. And in fact, it would have been competitive no matter how you looked at it. So what are the top brands in China? China Mobile. It's one thing to sell 300 million American cell phones. It's another thing to sell 1.3 billion people in China. There are very interesting ways in which cell phones work there, how people use them versus how they use them here. China Mobile is a big one. Industrial Commerce Bank of China, China Construction Bank, and you can imagine why both of those are extremely successful banks. There's another element which is very interesting with regard to China, which is the relationship between the banking sector and the private sector. China has historically said over the last 10 years, there is 120 companies we believe are strategic partners for China. And we are going to make sure they are world leaders. And what that means is we'll make sure they have the capital they need. Now you can imagine what would happen in the United States if we went to companies in the US government said, you know what, instead of, leaving it to the free market, we're going to say you are going to become the leading company in automotives, and we'll give you whatever financial support you need, very low-cost loans, even loan forgiveness if you need it. You can imagine what would have happened in those industries in the United States if they had that access to capital. Now, of course, here they might have screwed it up, but they're going to do that in China as well. But it gives those companies enormous leeway in terms of how they develop as a business, what they can do, and where they will develop. So Baidu being another company, Baidu is an internet company that's sort of like a communications company where people will Snapchat each other, that kind of thing. And the interesting thing with some of these companies is they're expanding these days into the West by acquiring Western companies, right? So you're starting to see Baidu, I think, going after Snapchat, and I think Tencent's another one that's also doing acquisitions as well. But there are a lot of these brands which we don't recognize, perhaps, you don't know the names, but you know products they own, like Haier, which is a appliance manufacturer, Haier. And they've acquired several manufacturing companies that you might be familiar. I think Amana is now owned by them. And many of the microwave parts or consumer appliances that we have may very well have been built by them, right? A lot of their components go into those. Tencent is also, it's another communications, like internet or telecommunications type company for China. So exports. Every year, China's exports have risen between 2000 and 2011, except for one, and that would probably be in 2007-8 when we had the economic crisis. So that's 542% growth in 11 years, right? If you look at U.S. exports with the rest of the world, they grew by about 80% during the same time. So in 2011, the U.S. exported more than $100 billion worth of goods to China. And at the same time, China's export-led growth lifted millions out of poverty and created a rapidly expanding, vibrant middle class, right? So China, on the other side of that, China offers tremendous growth to American companies. And you see that because if you ever spent any time at the American Chamber of Commerce in China, they've got people coming through there all the time trying to figure out how to get in. It had always been a much more difficult thing in the past because of party, because of the connection to party, because of the approval of Beijing on everything. That process was very cumbersome. Nevertheless, there were those who managed to get in and work constructively there for decades. But it was a very difficult process to get in. A lot of that's become streamlined, and more companies are there because of the market. It's a 1.3 billion person market. Granted, not all of them can afford the products, but with the middle class earning in the $20,000 to $30,000 range, quite a few products are well within their reach. And that's 200 million. Think about that. 200 million people. The United States population is about 350. So you're talking about a class within China that's, 2/3 of the United States, and that's still not the whole country. And as you can imagine, as the economy continues to develop there, things will get even better for Western companies that get their feet on the ground. In the case of GM, as I mentioned before, because they were early into China, the advantage they've had over any other foreign manufacturer, including Mercedes, is that they were there first, and the Chinese believe this is the brand, right? Didn't matter if you brought Ferrari in there, of course they've seen that, but Mercedes came in, didn't have anywhere near the luck that General Motors did, because they were on the ground longer and people were much more familiar with the brand. So the other thing which is kind of interesting has to do with what's going on. So there's this assumption that China is building everything. And in many industries right now, they are the world's leader. Coal, they're one of the world's leading producers of coal. Oil, they're actually a very big producer of it. The problem with China is that no matter how much they produce, they probably consume even more. Solar technology, cement, the list goes on and on. Clothing, furniture, long list of things that they produce well. But in many cases, a lot of these are low value-added industries. Right, the process of labor, taking a raw material and turning it into a finished good. Many of the things that they do in China right now, there's very little value added, and that's because the labor price is very low. But what they recognize is that low value added goods are really, they can't continue this process. They've got to come up with a higher value added approach in order for the economy to grow, in order for the country to become more affluent, more successful, and that's something they've got to do. So, here are the 7 strategic industries that they believe they need to focus on going forward. Energy saving and the environment and environmental protections at the top of the list for them. New generation and information technology, and there is enormous levels of education of that going on in China. Biology or biotech is a big one. High-end equipment manufacturing, new energy, new materials, and new energy cars, right? And recently, I don't know how many of you are familiar with some of the electric cars like Tesla. Most of you are familiar with them. How many of you have ever heard of Fisker? Yeah, you've heard of Fisker? How many of you are aware that a Chinese company just bought them? I'm sorry? Not exactly. They were just acquired by a Chinese company. So understand that when a Chinese company acquires Fisker, they acquire the technology too, right? You know, the interesting history of electric vehicles goes back to American car companies that had to do it because of the California zero emissions law, but hated the fact that they were forced to do it. So they destroyed their electric cars. The Japanese, who couldn't keep up with that development, developed hybrid vehicles. Turns out that was a better model, more parts break, in which case the car companies can still make more money. So they swung back to the hybrid model in the United States. But the electric vehicle market is taking off, and that's, I think, something the Chinese recognize. But here's a question. What does an iPhone teach us about how things work in China? Right? How many of you have iPhones? Okay. So if you think that an iPhone coming to the United States from China generates $178 in cost to Apple, which then passes that on to you at a much higher price. And you say, well, that's $2 billion in revenue that goes to China, that creates a deficit, a trade deficit with China. Does it really? As it turns out, when you start looking at some of the parts that are going into an iPhone, many of those parts are not made in China. Many of those parts are made in Germany. They're made in the United States. They're made in Korea. They're made in Japan. In fact, when you look at the amount of goods which are made in this whole process, you've got about $6.50 of that $178 that actually accrues to Chinese labor. And the rest of it actually comes from all those other countries. So when you say, well, you know, $2 billion, Apple's, generated that by bringing the iPhones from China, in fact, a lot of that money was round-tripped. American companies sending those parts over to China, the Chinese actually assembling the product and shipping it back to the United States, with very little of that cost actually coming from Chinese infrastructure, in other words, semiconductor companies, all those other really high-tech businesses that can push the country further forward. And this is part of what I mean when I say that they need to develop that infrastructure. In fact, looking at this, if you looked at the value added out of the $2 billion, something like $73 million of that is actually money generated for Chinese businesses like Foxconn that actually pay laborers within China that comes back to them. So yeah, about 3.6% of that $178, not that much. And it looks a little bit more like this, where we assume that it's 1.9 billion, which is coming out of China, but actually a lot of that is really, it's about 48 million of it with China, the rest with Japan, Germany, South Korea, and others. So when we look at investments, and I know I focus primarily on China, and I know you probably have interests in other parts of Asia, but given the time, I didn't know how much of that I could get into. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but countries like Vietnam present tremendous opportunities as well, about 90 million people, and of course, the Vietnamese, I happened to go there not too long ago, and I was absolutely captivated with Vietnam. Of all the Asian countries I visited, I believe the Vietnamese were the hardest working people I'd ever seen. And my experience there was I never saw anyone sitting down except for dinner. Right? They do things the hard way too, which really amazed me. I'd never seen people fish with actually got in the water up to their eyes with a net in their hand and tried to catch the fish by hand. You know, in America, we'd be sitting there on the shore with a fishing line, trying to figure out how to get the fish. There, they'll actually go out and get it. It's sort of mentality difference that, in the West, even in China, I don't think they were as hardcore as they were in Vietnam. But when you look at the manufacturing in Vietnam, they put the same kind of effort. They'll do it the hard way, but they'll do it. And, whereas China, there was a lot of robotics and a lot of high-tech building vehicles. In Vietnam, it was actually a lot more hand welding, and of course, that leads to a lot of quality issues. But they're coming along quite a bit as well. And they're actually happy to see Americans, believe it or not, right? Because in their mind, they won their war, right? Actually, not in their mind, they really did. But don't feel bad, we're in good company. They beat the Chinese a while back as well. So, okay, so U.S. investment in China is about $60 billion 30 years after China's reform, right? According to the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. The Chinese, on the other hand, investment in the U.S. in the third quarter is $6.3 billion. in investment projects in the U.S., but the Chinese investment in Europe is even higher than the U.S., even in the middle of the ongoing economic crisis. They're not asleep at the wheel. They're moving into the West. Historically, what they've done is they've gone after countries in Latin America, in Africa, because there's a mentality of, take the villages before you go after the city, right? So you start building your connections in the smaller parts of the world before you move into the bigger parts. So China's risen to become the world's leading exporter at the world's second largest economy after the U.S., and in fact, they're rapidly moving up on us. Their current economy is about at least half the size of us according to 2010, 2011 data, but growing at a rate where they will outpace us. Between our economic slide and their economic growth, we're going to come together a lot faster than most expect. And one of the interesting aspects of that is typically when a country becomes the world's largest economy, it's also the world's wealthiest. That won't be true when China gets there. Right? They'll still have one of the highest concentrations of poverty. They'll still have a lot of the social problems that are not as common in the West or in the developing world. So developed world, I should say. So yeah, $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves and at least $1.1 trillion. I think that's probably a bit low right now. It's probably closer to $2 trillion in debt obligations to the U.S. already. But the picture for China is not as rosy. And the reason it's not as rosy is for several things to keep in mind. Yes, there is an enormous amount of manufactured goods coming out of China to the West, but there's a lot of services that China has to buy in from the West. And what that's done is it's created a kind of services deficit at the same time that they have a product surplus, right? And there was recently an article in The Economist about this. China's export goods vastly exceed its imports, as always. But the imbalance is offset about $122 billion in 2013 on the services side, right? In addition, as Chinese become more affluent, they do a lot more traveling. One of the things that always struck me as odd, I remember taking a group of Chinese executives around Orlando, and we went to Disney, and I asked at the kiosk at Disney, can you give me a map in Chinese, in Mandarin? And they said, no, we don't have any. And I thought, that's odd, because they have them in other languages where the populations are significantly smaller than they are in China. And they said, well, we don't really get that many tourists from China. And you begin to wonder, well, is that a chicken or the egg situation, right? They need to have those available. But part of that is getting the expertise to write the maps up. So tourism is on the rise, $80 billion, and that creates a deficit for China as well. China's surplus could narrow further, right? Drop by another 0.4%, that's not a lot, but the exchange rate is rising because of that. Inflation, trade adjusted for inflation rose by 7%. And that means that things are not, they're going to be a little bit more of a challenge for China going forward. But this is a bigger problem for China. So that one-child policy that you're all familiar with, and it's one child in the city, two in the countryside. So if you have a farm, you can have 2 children. If you live in the city, you can have 1 child. And a lot of people misunderstand that. You can have as many children as you like, you just have to pay a lot of money. Right? So that's created a number of really big problems for folks in China. This is the population pyramid for China in 2013, and you could see that, the largest group are people in their 40s. And that what's going to happen in China is the population is going to get older. The number of people needed to support that population is going to get higher. And you're going to see that create all sorts of issues with regard to manufacturing and many of the other industries that are going on, that are happening in China. And you see that estimates by 2050 are that population will be might even fall by as much as half of what it is today. Right? And that's a significant issue with regard to China. There are other issues that go along with this. Many of you may be aware that, unfortunately, the way the Chinese, specifically farmers, view it, it would be better to have a son than to have a daughter. And what often happens in China is abandonment of children, especially female children, and that's created a huge problem with orphans in China. But here's the other side of that. It's also created a huge problem of single men who can't find partners. It's also added another dimension, which is that married couples, spouses, in China it's different than America in that in America you get married. You find someone you like, you get married. Maybe you pay for an expensive wedding. If you're smart, you elope, and your parents and no one else has to really pay the bill. But what often happens is we do that here. In China, there's a dowry expected, and the dowry is significant when you compare it to the income. Often families work 5 years, and I'm not talking about the individual, I'm talking about the whole family. They'll work for 5 years to raise the money so that their son can get married. Well, they've got a new thing on the rise in China, which is called divorce. And a lot of Chinese are not used to this, and what that means is your family spent 5 years raising the money for you to get married. You didn't treat your spouse well, and the next year you're single again. So the process starts all over, and you're not going to have a very happy family on that one. So that's become a major issue in China as well. And you think about it from that perspective, that's one thing, but consider the sheer number of males that will be single, that will be young, and when you start thinking about where problems come from in countries, it's usually from that group. So China is going to have a major issue to contend with over the next few decades. By contrast, here's India. So unlike China, they don't have a one-child policy. And India already has about 1.2 billion people, so they're not that far behind China. And so within the next decade or so, India will pass China as the most populous country in the world. Yes. And so that's another issue because India is a very different place than China. And they're very different from several reasons. The British left behind one of their most distinguished features, bureaucracy. And it was a wonderful thing for the UK. I mean, if you've spent time in the UK, which I've spent quite a bit, bureaucracy is honed to a fine art in the UK. The real holders of power in Britain are never the people who are in charge. They're always their assistants, the people beneath them that approve the forms, watch the forms, stamp the forms, deal with all that stuff. And in India, there's quite a bit of that as well. I think that being another issue also. The other, and I think the bigger problem with India, is industry concentration. So when you look at China, there are probably over 100 automobile companies. And what that means is you've got a lot of different people making cars. And no one has that dominant position. There are a few that are very large, but it can happen that a smaller company could bypass them with the right kind of deals, with the right kind of product. In India, there are about 3 or 4 large companies, and that's it. Many of the products made in India are made for the local market again, although there has been Tata, which is the largest car brand in India, has been doing some acquisition outside of the country. And they're making extremely inexpensive cars in India, even relative to China. So the issue is about industry concentration, but as Americans have found, entrepreneurship is really the key to the economy going from whatever position it's in to kind of developing from there. And India has made its own jumps and transitions as well, from largely agricultural, thanks to the World Bank for advising India to do that, to more intellectual. So there's enormous amount of intellectual capital there, intellectual property related work, programming, phone centers, a lot of things which actually turn out to be higher margin and more value added. And that's done a wonderful job in raising the net wealth of people within a certain class within India, but it's also been restricted to that group, the people who get into universities in India. And we take for granted the ability to get into universities. We're in the university club. But in countries like India, there just aren't enough institutions. So the competitiveness to get into a university is so high that it would be as if, unless your kid's in the top 1 or 2%, well, I think it's maybe in the top 5% of the country, they're not going to college. Right? And that changes their career, their trajectory, which is why many students will, if they come from fairly affluent families and didn't get into one of the schools in India, they may come here to the United States. Right? So that's part of what's going on. So here's a little bit of what's going on with India. I mentioned Sunghu before. Here's an example. So in the lower right, that picture right over there is one of the Chinese treasure fleet in the 1400s by the Chinese Admiral Sun He. They had about 1,500 of those in their fleet of about 3,500 ships. The ship to the right of that happens to be the Santa Maria, the one that Columbus actually sailed across to the United States. So that's just an idea, and the difference is that the bigger ship was 50 years, no, actually it was about 100 years older. So the Chinese were building bigger, and there's a sort of idea of what the fleet might have looked like as it made its way across to Africa. That's about as far as they went. Decided there was nothing further west to look at or worthwhile discovering, and then went back to China where the emperor eventually decommissioned the fleat. In other words, destroyed it. leaving the Indian Ocean and the South China Seas open to anyone that wanted to. 50 years later, Vasco da Gama sailed in completely unmolested in a ship about the size of Columbus's ship and wreaked havoc on everyone in the South Asian seas, which made the country what it is, made the West the sort of controller of that region for several decades, or several centuries, I should say. I'm going to do this quickly because I think Aaron's given me the time's up, the hook. I'm getting the hook right now. But what I wanted to say is this. There's a couple of other issues, and this is an important one. Most countries declare their legal boundaries out at sea, 50-mile limit, right? 200 is what they do. But if you do that in the South China Sea, what does that include? Well, it includes Vietnam. It includes parts of Malaysia, the Philippines. You've got all these areas. Japan is also in the middle of this. Taiwan actually is in your jurisdiction if you're China. And we've seen recent conflicts over land in that region that have been directly related to that. And I would add that you'll see more of them. And the Chinese are even building the military fleet to fend off American aircraft carriers. They actually have designed ships to fight with aircraft carriers should it come down to it. Another issue, which is an important one, this comes down to China and India, and this comes down to water. They're the two most populous countries in the world, and the biggest problem both countries have is water. And most of that water actually comes from Tibet. It comes from Nepal, the runoffs from the Himalayas. And the Chinese are busy damming it up right now. And you can imagine what that's going to mean to the northern part of India. And so this is a very big dispute that threatens to devolve into a major international conflict. The other third issue, which I think is also critical, and this has to do with all over Asia, when you look at parts of the world and their concentration of coastal lands and coastal population, Asia has the largest percentage of people living on coastal areas. Now, whether you buy into who's causing global warming, one thing we can be clear about is that there is something happening, and tides are rising. And in fact, if you looked at the sea level rises by country, what you would notice is that they're rising at a much more rapid rate. Just ask anyone that was living in the UK this winter, and they will tell you that large parts of the coastline were destroyed by raging storms. They'd never seen anything like that before. So considering countries like Indonesia, which is the fourth most populous country in the world, ranging with 17,000 islands, you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be dealing with this, and China being a very large one. Lastly, and this is getting back to what I talked about before, our CEOs, do they always get it? Well, they believe China, India, and Brazil are, definitely the most important countries for growth in the future, but not as important as they used to be, right? I'm not sure that they're on the right track with that, and time will tell, but, at that point, I'll stop there and kind of turn it over to questions. I didn't go too far over.
When I talked to Mark about his presentation, he said, as an academician, he loves questions.
Yeah.
And the first one is coming from the back. Joel, you'll be number one.
Hopefully I can answer these.
Thanks, Sarah. I wonder, with the so many people making vast fortunes in China, whether that money is leaving China or a good part of it being reinvested in China. That seemed to be a complaint among many people when I visited China, that a great deal of money is leaving the country and is not being reinvested to help those with the greatest need.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things with China is that China is a communist country when it wants to be, and a capitalist country when it wants to be as well. And, it's a sort of, the Western world was you're either X or you're Y. You can't be anything in between, and China's basically redefined that. So if you look at wealth concentration, you're starting to see the same thing we see in the West. You're starting to see a lot more wealth concentration into fewer hands in China. And so you have some of the wealthiest people in the world connected with China right now. And many of those folks diversify because they recognize, if you were in Russia, for example, one minute you're the wealthiest person in Russia, the next minute you're serving time in a gulag somewhere. Your property being confiscated and redistributed to friends of Putin, right? But in China, it doesn't happen as often. Occasionally it does. But many of these extremely wealthy people in China are doing what a lot of other people do. They're buying real estate in other countries. They're buying businesses in other countries because the Chinese recognize that, like the Europeans learned and the Japanese learned, that you have to diversify your business. If you want it to be successful, if the currency continues to rise, you have to have operations in other countries where you're selling your products or risk losing those markets. So a lot of it's leaving the country. The main issue has to do with, if China allows the currency to truly float, they could see 20 to 30% rise in the RMB against the dollar. Well, if you think of that on wholesale prices, that creates another problem. So a lot of dollars currency ends up in the hands of the Chinese government, which will then turn around and reinvest it in the U.S. in the form of treasuries, right? So I'm not sure if I answered that well, but I tried to, yeah.
What is China doing in regards to the industries and the control of the severe pollution problem they have?
Well, when you looked at what I showed you before about the key industries that they're trying to focus on, one of the things you notice is they recognize it's a problem and they're leading the world in some of this. But that also has problems. The solar, cement, and all these other things which they're developing, which they have their industry leaders on, they have huge surpluses with right now. So they're building more solar panels than they can use, and they're not finding the customers out there the way they should. And so that's creating another problem for them as well. But they recognize the need for clean technology. They recognize the need to develop experts in that area. They're training hundreds or thousands of engineers in that. And a lot of the newer innovations are happening there as well. I mean, we have major battles if someone tries to set up a wind farm in the United States. And there are plenty of places to do it. I've driven through sections of China where there are 50 or 60 miles of wind farms. In the Gobi Desert where there's nothing else other than wind farms and rocks. And they don't seem to have a problem there, and they're generating huge amounts of electricity from it. So they recognize it's an issue, but at the moment, a lot of the industrial development is in other parts of China, so around Shanghai, closer to the border with Hong Kong, up near Beijing. But even when you get out into the countryside, you can thank Mao for this, there are lots of factories and there's still lots of pollution. And in China, some of the estimates I've heard are as many as 800,000 people a year are dying of pollution-related deaths. You can imagine what would happen if that was going on here in the United States. There'd be enormous outcry. A couple of industry people would probably be hung from the rafters. In China, they're trying to do something, but it's happening slowly. It is happening, but it's happening slowly.
This kind of goes to the first question about where the Chinese are investing their money, and I don't know if you saw the 60 Minutes episode. It's run twice now, where this was not the wealthiest, but they were the middle class investing in all of these condominiums, and they would stay empty.
Yes.
So it was like this huge bubble that they're creating.
Yeah, well, the Chinese are not any different than us. They're big on bubbles also. The thing is, they happen very quickly in China. And ironically, their markets snap back much faster than they do in the West. But the issue about overconstruction is a major issue. There are ghost cities in China. There are actually ghost parking lots in China as well, where they're overproducing cars and don't know what to do with them. They're overproducing. But remember, some of this is being government driven, right? We need to build these cities because eventually the people will move from the countryside into the city. So it's in anticipation of what's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And the construction issues, there are major issues with how they construct and the quality of the buildings. But yeah, there's a lot of it going on right now. Speculation, the Chinese speculate just as heavily, if not more so than we do. One of the biggest problems they have is people not really understanding the markets, throwing a lot of money into them, and losing it very quickly, right? Whoops. I can hear you, but...
Can we blame Nixon for opening up China and then the loss of jobs in the United States? Because it seems like as they have risen, we don't make underwear here anymore. We don't do a lot of things we used to do.
I like blaming Nixon. No, I'm just kidding. The short answer for that is, I have the same discussion with my students about globalization. And my answer to them is, you can stop globalization. You can do your part to stop it. When you buy your clothing, look to see if it says made in China. If it does, don't buy it. Buy only stuff that says made in the US, buy only stuff that says made in a country that you want to support, and the answer is good luck, right? because even with the internet, it's hard to find the companies that make those products, because a lot of people have decided, you know, if I'm going to spend $3 on a pair of underwear, if I'm going to spend $20 on a pair of underwear, I'll go for the $3 pair, right? They're not going to last any longer. And so people have voted with their feet. It's whether Nixon had done it or whether it had been those countries developing on their own. Part of what happens is a natural effect of the world becoming more interlinked. And, you know, if you really want to blame anyone, blame the internet. And that goes back to the Defense Department, because when they developed it initially as a means of communication, nobody anticipated it becoming what it is today. And tying so many people in the world together in the way that it does, and facilitating the type of commerce. You can look at a company like Amazon, and you could say, well, they put the whole book business, for the most part, out of business. And they're starting to do that with a lot of other consumer products. But as much as Amazon owns that industry, what is 3D printing going to do to Amazon in a few years? Right? What are some of the other technologies that are out there going to do? How's that going to change things? Mind you, these aren't new technologies. 3D printing exploded when the patents on 3D printing expired. But it's been around since the 90s. It's just starting to take off now that it's not as expensive and it's more wide open. So we're going to see a lot of changes over the next year. Whether Nixon had done it, or whether it had been someone from the UK or someone from Russia, I doubt it would have been someone from Russia. But let's just say that it would have happened. I think you would have found countries in Asia, especially through the United Nations, trying to figure out ways to improve the economic condition, and invariably ending up doing something like what's going on today. But ironically, and I will add one caveat to that, most of those really brilliant people who have helped turn China around and other parts of Asia, that were educated in the United States, right, and returned to Asia after they got their education, more now because we don't let them stay. So
I want to thank you for a real well-rounded talk. You got
thank
the
you for sitting there.
highlights and the lowlights. But I have a feeling that the speakers on China tend to emphasize the positive and kind of skip over the demographics, which you did not do. But I would have carried it further and said the demographics are what's going to diminish China's economic future when they start having the young people now getting old with not enough workers to support them. Same things we're having. Then they got to have Social Security of some sort, pensions of some sort. They improved so much lately because they started from a lower base. But I have a feeling that they're going to start slowing down considerably once this level is reached in, say, 10 or 15 years. What's your opinion?
Well, I think, I've heard this from other people in the sense of, the one-child policies had a major impact on China, but a simple solution, and it depends on whether or not they're going to decide to do it, is remove the one-child policy, right? That would change things, that would start things moving in another direction. They can do a lot of things. They still have that opportunity, but also consider that China sits in a region with one of the world's, if you look at the world's population, most of it sits in that region. And there are many countries that will be poorer than China. And what will probably happen is you'll see a lot of those folks from Indonesia, from other countries, going to China for opportunities, as you do today. Folks from India end up in certain countries in the Middle East because the opportunities in India are limited. You may very well even see folks from India heading over to China for opportunities to support the wealthier classes in China. The issue with regard to Social Security or social safety nets in China is a big one, because they had one and then removed it effectively. And that's left the poorer classes in China in a much worse situation. And there are a lot of demonstrations on that issue that we don't hear about. But if you consider the speed at which China adapted to a lot of their social problems, or many of those social problems, it's conceivable that within the next decade or so, they're going to come up with some pretty innovative solutions to some of those as well. I'm not as optimistic. So in other words, like you say, I don't have that rosy-colored view of China that everything's beautiful, wonderful, and keep going that way. They're going to have some serious problems that go along with success. No leading country in the world doesn't. But their problems will be much more significant in certain areas because of the size of the problem that they're dealing with, as opposed to and the range of problems they're dealing with.
Since you brought up India, I'd like to ask you a question about it. There's a lot of the provinces in northern and northeastern India have been taken over by the Maos, and I was even told when I was over there in India that it probably would not be safe for an American to travel alone in some of those provinces. And I'm kind of curious as to what you see happening, what kind of impact that's going to have on the Indian economy as it goes forward.
I think India's biggest problem is easily the issue of water. I mean, and India is very, very sensitive to that issue, because you've got a lot of land in India that is, starting to be. It's not only desert, but it's getting worse, and with a lot of the runoff, a lot of the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas, the availability of water is declining. Then add the dam project, which the Chinese have put in there, and that's a bigger issue. Also, in China and within India, on both parts in that region, you have a high concentration of Muslim population, and in China, that's led to a lot of clashes. So the Chinese solution to dealing with it was to dilute it down by moving a lot of non-Muslim population, non-Muslim Chinese, into that region to try to dilute the number of people to a smaller percentage. It didn't work, and in Urumqi and a couple of the other areas in that region, it's exploded into a lot of conflict. So India has direct conflict with China along that region, and a lot of those groups are, I would say at best, loosely connected. But you also have Pakistan up in that region as well. So India is going to have its hands full. The bigger question, which I think no one's really clear on, is what position will we take in supporting whom in whatever conflict eventually develops? Do we support India? Do we support Pakistan? Do we support China? I mean, it's a big question right now, and no one's really clear on it. Yeah. And, time will tell, as it develops, what's going to happen. But I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you're saying, but I'm answering to the best of my knowledge right now.
Did I understand you correctly that the male's family pays the dowry?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You touched on this, but I'd like to go into this a little further about their air pollution.
Yes.
It's so bad, you can almost never find a recently taken picture in China without having a gray or a brown sky, never a blue sky in the background anymore. So obviously it's getting worse. Now, so much of this is caused by their coal-fired technology, and they continue to build coal-fired power plants, and if their number of automobiles are increasing as fast as you say, as I recall, in 1990 there were something like maybe 2,000 private vehicles in China, and that was it. Yeah. Here we are 24 years later, and my God, they're all over the place. But is anything truly being done or even planned, either from a people standpoint or a government standpoint, to try to control this expansion of coal-fired technology and to try to control this pollution problem, not only air pollution but water pollution as well?
Well, it's a good question, and one of the things that I would say would be this. I'm going to start by answering it one way, which is that they're going with the resource which is most readily and cheaply available. So coal being something they produce enormous amounts of, they're going to use it right now. But as you saw before, the technologies they're going after are the cleaner technologies. I'm old enough to remember, and I know I'm old enough to remember a point in the United States where we were incredibly polluted, where I grew up in New York City, and we would have pollution episodes in New York where they would tell you not to go out. Or I remember the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania catching on fire, one of the rivers there, right? Because there was so much pollution, and other rivers in New York as well doing the same thing when we were much more industrialized. Well, a lot of those factories are in China now. So they're having the same problems we got rid of. The air is cleaner in the United States. You can drink the water in most places. The Schuylkill doesn't catch on fire anymore. You even see fish swimming in certain parts of the Hudson River now. So, a lot of things have changed, for the better in some parts in the U.S. As China becomes more affluent, people are going to start pushing for it. But I mean, I've had my own personal experiences with the episode there. I was telling some of the members of my table my last trip to China, I ended up with pneumonia from the air quality while I was there, because it was really that bad. And some of the places we went to, absolutely horrendous. So spending 6 months there, you really, really have to be prepared to deal with a high degree of pollution. That being said, the Chinese just currently accept it as a necessary evil, but they all are pushing for a better situation. It's just, how will you get there? Gasoline consumption, most of the cars made are currently using gas-powered engines, which has created another problem. The demand for gasoline, which is significantly higher than China is able to produce, and that puts them in direct conflict. Many of us may remember a few years back when one of China's largest oil companies, CNOOC, tried to buy Unocal in California, and the Congress recognized that not as a corporate takeover, but as a government takeover, right? Because they saw CNOOC as being largely government funded, and therefore it was China's government indirectly trying to buy a strategic American resource. That was the way they viewed it. The reality is, who ended up buying it? It ends up getting bought. China didn't get it because of the pressure being put on them. They ended up buying up companies in Canada and other places in the world. At the end of the day, that market is traded on commodities exchanges, and you buy your oil from whoever it is, and it goes wherever you bought it from. So owning Unocal would have given them an advantage. One of the interesting things about Unocal is much of their oil drilling production was actually in Southeast Asia, which was part of why they were interested in CNOOC was interested in it. But really what they need is more clean technology, and they're leading that. By the way, they're also becoming one of the world's leading producers of nuclear technology too. Not that that's clean, but it's an alternative to coal, right? It creates its own problems, as we've learned recently with Japan, as we've seen historically. But if your choice is choking to death with carbon from coal or dealing with a nuclear hazard, I think at the moment they're beginning to think that might be the least worst alternative, right?
How do you explain what China achieved in construction in about 10 or 15 years took us over hundreds of years? Cities like Shanghai,
Yeah.
Compare it with New York. How do you explain this?
Well, I think the short answer to that is 1.3 billion people. The slightly longer answer is regulation and other things. The construction regulations aren't anywhere near as difficult as they are in the U.S. And while you can see cities being built very rapidly in China, you can also see pictures of buildings falling over. I mean, the standards are nowhere near what they are in the West, but they can move quickly and you can get a lot of people. One of the most amazing things for me to see when I go there is, you have scaffolding up around a building in the United States. It's steel scaffolding. You go to China, it's bamboo. They build these things out of bamboo, and they build them up to cover the entire side of a building, and they build very quickly. Again, when you have that many, the last time I was in Shanghai, I think they had something like 1/3 of all the world's building cranes were probably in the city putting up skyscrapers. Right? Yeah, I mean, it was unbelievable, and to look at Shanghai did not look like any other large city. It seemed so much more technologically advanced from what you were seeing when you looked at the skyline of Shanghai that it was impressive. But again, the money's there. You have all this surplus, so they can not only afford to pay a lot of workers to build those buildings, they can afford to bring the top construction people from around the world to China as well. And that's enabled them to move a lot faster. Add that other element, which is Western businesses trying to get into China and wanting to have their own places, and you've got a recipe for rapid construction, rapid development. The other bigger problem, and this is one we have that they don't. If you live in this neighborhood, you have a nice house in a great location, and the city wants to build where your house is, they're going to have a hell of a time trying to get your land, right? They're going to have to pay you something of value. The Chinese government can say, nope, we want that block, and down goes your building, right? And up goes a new building. So if you don't have to deal with the issues of, ownership, private property, the way that we do, you can move a lot faster. I mean, you can imagine that in Europe it would be even more difficult because of all these landmark buildings, and trying to knock something down and put a new building up is just not going to happen. Right? So that's another reason why they've been able to move so quickly, I think.
Mark, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for putting up with me.
In 2 weeks, we have Jeff Rupert, professor of jazz from UCF, who will be talking to us, and it should be a very, very interesting presentation.